Hello and welcome to the Swinging Christies, the podcast about Agatha Christie in the swinging 60s. I'm Dr. Mark Aldridge. I'm an Agatha Christie historian, writer, speaker, chatter, just generally anything Agatha Christie.
And I'm Gray Robert Brown. I'm a writer and a Christie cult leader.
Oh, wow. Okay. How are you, Gray? What have you been up to?
I'm good. Do you know what I was going to tell you is... in the last 10 days, I have done not one but 2 Agatha Christie puzzles.
Wow.
I know. Or I should say
puzzles.
Yes, yeah. I should say I've contributed to the effort of puzzles. I can't take full credit for.
They're quite difficult, those ones.
They are quite difficult.
But they're really good illustrations.
Yeah, I love them.
And there's those little Easter eggs and things.
Yes, and this is what I was going to say. Thing that I noticed that will make us very happy as diehards and as 60s obsessives is that the 60s books get a really fair showing.
Oh, good.
Because, sometimes stuff like that, you go with the iconic stuff. You'll see references to Orient Express and things like that. But no, that in both the Poirot, we did the World of Hercule Poirot one and we did the General Agatha one where she sat in Greenway. And yeah, in both of them, there were many 60s novels references, which I was very pleased to see. And the best bit was when... so I did one of them with Johnny, my partner, and he said at one point, he was like... so what was Agatha saying about pigs then? And I was like, oh, I don't know. And then I went, oh, are there 5 of them? And he went, no, there's 3 of them. And I was like, oh, that's weird. And then he put a few more pieces of the puzzle in and went, oh, no, there are 5 of them. And I was like, okay, 5 little pigs. There you go. Yeah. But the 60s got a showing as well. Yeah. How are you?
I'm good, yes.
Yeah?
We've just had a pale horse a thon,
yeah. Very relevant to both this episode and the next episode. Yeah, because I'd never seen. So we watched the ITV version from the 90s, and which I'd never seen, and you'd seen, but not for a while.
Yeah, not for ages.
But there is. I remember it. You talk about it in on screen, of course, and then the Sarah Phelps version, which was broadcast in 2020, which I love. I love all the Sarah Phelps adaptations. I think that's slightly controversial in some corners of fandom.
I think so. I think that, and then There Were None is very well received, and I think the others are more mixed. But definitely new takes on Agatha Christie. I always like a new take.
Yeah,
who wants to see the same old sort of?
It's true. And I think our overall consensus was that both were strong in different ways, weren't they?
Yes.
Both of those versions were.
They're also both really 60s, which is sort of what we were looking out for, because we were a bit like, are they going to try and make it a bit of a sort of, modernised, bland idea of the past? But they absolutely situate themselves definitely in the 60s.
Yeah. Even with on-screen captions. And the soundtrack, there's You Really Got Me by the Kinks in the ITV version, which is 64. So I think it's interesting, actually, the ITV one made it even more 60s than the book was, because they pushed it later into the decade. Had more of that kind of like flowing hair, and it was more, we said while we were watching it was a bit Pale Horse via Third Girl.
It was so much what was Third Girl, especially stuff that was like, in the studio flat or the artist studio. Yeah. And there's loads of it that were like, we've just been talking about this, but they're not in this book.
About a different book. Yeah, because I pointed out the windows of the artist studio are like they're literally op art. They're with the block colours. It's And very, but in both we got kind of those swinging-y coffee bar scenes, which we do get in both the Pale Horse book and Third Girl. But it's great to see because, we've said on the podcast several times about how so many adaptations of later books push the chronology back and set them in the 30s or 40s or whatever. And to see the ITV Pale Horse doing the opposite was quite exceptional.
Including the fashions was what really stood out to me as well, was that it did do that thing which is really making it so 60s that everybody is wearing the height of fashion at all times. Like everyone looks like they're about to go to a photo shoot.
Yes, and we were like, surely not everyone in much deeping is is like,
wearing their berets
going to Bieber on the King's Road in Chelsea. Yeah. But also we just recorded the fashion episode, haven't we?
Yeah,
so we were on clothes watch. But and both do have moments of proper horror as well. Both do engage in those tropes, which is true to the book, which was quite fun fantasy, and relevant for this because this episode. Mark, what's that behind you? No, seriously, what's that behind you? It's a model of the Spice Girls. Because we're in your office. No, this week. It's horror.
All this time we could have been friends.
So obviously, horror wasn't invented in the 1960s. We know that. We're talking about a centuries-old tradition here, but horror is kind of particularly relevant to the decade.
It's funny because I teach film and television history quite a lot, so I'm coming at this slightly from a screen angle, but it's quite a nice barometer, actually, of the way that horror changes, because in the late 50s in particular, there's this movement away from what we might consider to be quite classical tropes of like the scary castle, the ghosts, Frankenstein's monster, Dracula up in his castle on the cliff and all that sort of stuff, all this gothic. But in the late 50s, that starts to change into actually being a bit more, well, what about your neighbour? What about the guy down the road who perhaps is a little bit odd or that you don't really know that much about? What might they be hiding? What secrets are actually out there? So horror becomes more domestic, but it also becomes much more localized, and the fear becomes quite different. And in terms of things like screen horror, we see this in things like fear of might your neighbour be an alien, aka might they be a communist? There's a real mix there between what's actually the truth. Can you trust these people who you think you know?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's borne out by the kind of literary scene as well. I was thinking of stuff like, well, we've got Shirley Jackson's final novel, We've Always Lived in the Castle, that's published in 1962. And she was doing the same thing, really, which is situating. I always think of it as like the dirt under the fingernails. It's like it's the mundane, it's the fingernails, but it's the dirt underneath that she's focusing on. And that is a glove in hand fit for Christie, really.
Yeah, there's a bit in The Pale Horse.
The Pale Horse is a standalone novel that explores mysterious goings-on and unexplained deaths at a countryside inn from 1961.
Where a character says, it was the matter-of-fact way she said it that was so spine-chilling. And this matter-of-factness about actually quite horrific things. We get that quite a lot about characters in the 60s in particular being really quite almost relaxed and casual about really terrible things that they're doing.
And that makes it more horrific, doesn't it? And Christie knows what she's doing in that. I think there's a great deal of skill in that not being presented in a very flowery way.
And we know that she went to see later in the decade Rosemary's Baby, the film, which is a brilliant example of this. What are your neighbours up to? I mean, I don't know that Satanists is necessarily the thing that we would always leap to.
Maybe don't say that too loudly. The walls are thin here, Mark.
But yeah, this is the whole point of it, is that all sorts of society, some perhaps outwardly more respectable than others, in Rosemary's Baby, behind closed doors, are quite happily, casually having a little drink whilst they're hailing Satan and perhaps, ensuring that Satan's child is going to come into the earth. I did try, when I wrote Poirot, to work out whether she could have seen it before she wrote Halloween Party. And the date's just about, if you squint, she could have been... Like, she could have seen it while she was... Yeah. Because this whole thing about it being released in the UK quite a bit later than America, I seem to recall when I checked.
Right.
But it was like, she could have been working on Halloween Party when she saw it. And I can really see those links there, that outwardly respectable people actually doing really terrible things.
Yeah. And either way, it's in the zeitgeist, isn't it?
Yeah.
All of these things are kind of swirling around. And you said about whatever happened to Baby Jane.
Which is mentioned in Nemesis, which is a bit beyond. So there's this bit in Nemesis where Miss Marple sees Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, the book, and she says, "Oh dear, it's a sad world one lives in." And that sounds to me like she doesn't actually know what the book's about, and is thinking that this is going to be some terrible story about a horrific thing that's happened to a baby that's called Jane, whereas actually it's a story about Baby Jane being this sort of musical performer as a child and then growing up and not having a great adulthood.
But obviously using that as a touchstone, even I guess she was writing Nemesis 6 or 7 years after Baby Jane the film came out, but or thinking about it at least, but that still stands in culture for the sinister, and she's aware of those touchstones. Like we saw in the rock and roll episode, there are these references that she gets. As you say, the cinema horror is kind of moving towards something domestic. We do have Hammer still kind of trundling along in the background through this period, don't we? And reach for your glasses, because I'm going to mention Sandbrook. But Sandbrook makes the point that Hammer Horror, the British film production company that made famously loads of gothic films, horror films, there is this general licentiousness that they stand for, because there's a titillating sexual element, but also pushing the boundaries in terms of violence, and those things going hand in hand. And I think that just helps to form the backdrop against which Christie is writing.
So what stood out to you as the sort of horrifying elements in the genre sense of Christie's work in the 1960s?
There's so much, isn't there? She really does push boundaries in these 60s books, which is one of the reasons why we love them. A couple of images really stood out to me. One is the chest in Spanish Chess.
The Adventure of the Christmas Pudding and a Selection of Entrees is a collection of early short stories, including the titular The Adventure of the Christmas Pudding and The Mystery of the Spanish Chest, both of which were rewritten for publication in 1960.
And we get a chest again in the centre of The Rats as well.
The Rats is a one-act thriller play, part of the Rule of Three collected plays about a pair of lovers trapped in a flat from 1962.
And it's literally in the centre, it's on stage, that's a play, so it's very confronting as an image. And this idea that something awful might be in there, a body might be in there, a secret is in there, is a kind of veritable Pandora's box. It's a really powerful image that she plays with, I think, and a horror one. And the other image that reoccurs through this decade as something that she's clearly playing with is the act of falling out of a window, which is, again, this very kind of powerful kinetic image symbol. And we get the possibility of it rising again in The Rats. There's a sense where, when they're seeing if they can get out, one of them rushes to the window, they see it's only a sheer drop. But we get someone having fallen in The Patient, and the image recurs in Third Girl as well. And again, it's this, when you really think about that as a way to go, frankly.
Well, it's funny because you're not the only person to have noted that as an interesting device, because you haven't seen it. But when you do come and see Haunting in Venice, actually you'll see that's one of the 60s things that gets picked up beyond Halloween Party, because Haunting in Venice, as you know, is not a strict, close retelling of Halloween Party.
Wait, what?
I know. It has been mentioned by one or two commentators. A couple of fans.
I think I saw something about that on Twitter,
Oh, just the one or two.
I remember you saying, it's almost Third Girl-esque in some ways, although
it really does pick up. Yeah, we'll save that.
But I remember you saying, just back on the Rule of Three, I remember you saying when we talked about these before, that there's something in the makeup of the 3 one-act plays that acts as an opening salve, horrific and palate cleanser kind of arc. This is slightly complicated by the fact that we're not entirely sure what order is intended, because accounts vary. So it's either Rats, Afternoon at the Seaside, Patient, or my Samuel French copy goes Afternoon at the Seaside, Rats, Patient. But either way, I think that order works. You've got the kind of confronting beginning in the Rats, you've got the palate cleanser of Afternoon, and then you've got the really return to horror at the end. Or if you do it the other way, then you ease in the audience with the frivolities and trivialities of Afternoon at the Seaside before challenging them with the Rats, and then going even further, because I think The Patient is properly creepy and harrowing, and I think that really nails it at the end.
Well, funnily, the reason why I was thinking about that order is I always remember when the League of Gentlemen did their Christmas special, and it's 3 different stories, that they said at the time that they were following, I guess it's things like Dead of Night and stuff, but those little, anthology films and stuff, which have got 3 different bits. But they say you have a scary one, a funny one, then a really scary one.
Fantastic. Well, that is Rats, Afternoon, Patient.
Yeah. And you see how that works, actually.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Reading it again, I was struck by, there is a reading you could mount of The Rats as this sinister, thrilling 60s bottleneck, nasty little thing. The history that it's part of is the Locked Room mystery, which Christie's kind of made her name on. It's almost like this dirty update of the Mousetrap or something. Do you know what I mean?
Rats in a trap. The last line.
Exactly.
You know, that's what we are. We're caught with rats in a trap.
Yeah. We've gone from the relative cleanliness of Golden Age mice to the grime of urban rats. There is something playing there. And I was really struck by the way Alec describes the flat. You know, he says, "This whole flat looks rather cruel to me, so hard and cold. These four walls that hold you in and just the minimum of necessities to live in it. This is the way people live now." You know, we talked about this in Money. It's even that has changed. What a horrible place to be shut up in if you couldn't get out. I mean, those aren't the proscenium arch sets of Christie's earlier plays, like The Mousetrap, where it's, you know, lovely wood panels and stained glass windows. This is like, you can almost imagine the walls closing in on them.
Yes, in a place that ostensibly is supposed to be, you know, freeing and liberating because loads of people can live in these places now, and there are not supposed to be lots of people around because you're living alongside people. But actually, that is, you know, superficial because you can be trapped there.
It's funny, I was just thinking, as an aside, I wonder if, you know, it kind of comes out of the Soviet Union, this idea that and socialism, you know, a high rise with equal sized living units that are all kind of equal but slightly austere and bare is the apotheosis of socialist thinking. And I wonder if there's a real life horror thing going on there as well, and how classic Agatha to be slightly disdainful of something socialism.
A huge social experiment that we, you know, millions of people were after the Second World War in particular were thrown into with no real choice over the matter.
Yeah, and it's very Ballardian as well, isn't it? And,
yes,
and actually that's interesting because Ballard, you know, High Rise and Crash are a way off for the time that we're looking at, but he did start writing in the 60s, and there's clearly something in the air with the way that writers like him, like Christie, are grappling with these symbols of modernity, and the fact that they confront them with and associate them with horror tropes is very telling. And then The Patient.
The Patient is a one-act play, part of the Rule of Three, about a hospitalised woman who may be able to expose the truth about her accident, from 1962.
It is horrific, isn't it? The contraption.
Yes.
The kind of truth-telling device.
Actually, they've fallen out of a window, haven't they?
They have, yes. Hence
So,
or were they pushed?
And if they were pushed...
Who by?
And could they communicate who by if they could only be away? And this is where the contraption comes in.
What a terrible ending to The Patient would it be if they got an answer out of them and then it was like, I don't know, didn't see.
Yeah.
It's not like, it was her, she pushed me. It's like, don't know.
But it's funny.
I had my back to them.
Because you watch it going, is this Agatha doing science fiction or is this something else? And actually in the end, she's not doing science fiction. That this contraption sort of isn't real. It's
that's one
all
of the clever
a bit of
reversals.
A trap, which is so clever. But you're not quite sure. You know, there's something off about it. You know that it's not going to be as linear as it's presented, which is, oh, what a terrible accident, but don't worry, we've got a way that they can communicate very, very slowly some of the facts about the incident.
But that just ramps up the tension, doesn't it? It's incredible. I think the way that, as in the slow communication and the way that the story unfolds as well. I think maybe there's a perception that Christie is quite upfront with exposition, but that really throws you in it. And as I was reading it, because sadly I couldn't see it, it's obviously written to be seen, but I did find myself, I was grappling for what exactly was going on, and that adds to this sinister atmosphere. And I think the way the contraption is spoken about and situated on stage, it does have this. I mean, this is the period of, you know, the summer they electrocuted the Rosenbergs, and actually we're coming on to Sylvia Plath later, and, you know, like electroshock therapy for homosexual men and things like that. And there's a frisson around the literal electricity of that machine. So Dr. Ginsberg says, Mr. Lanson here has fixed up a certain apparatus of an electrical nature. You see, there is a small rubber bulb. When that bulb is pressed, a red light appears on the top of the apparatus. The slightest pressure will operate it.
They read out the alphabet, don't they? And then when... you do sort of think, is this great theatre? Like
No, I do. That's what I mean.
And yet
the
it is, isn't it? But it's
yeah.
quite tense.
It really keeps you.
Because when they first did it, I thought, oh my goodness, is she really going to go this? But also, of course, breaks it off at the most tense moments of when you're thinking, just as sort of maybe things are being spelt out.
I'm sure in Julius Green's book, Julius Green, the Agatha Christie historian who writes extensively about her theatre work in particular, I'm sure he talks about that there was a lot of discussion about the ending.
Yes, so originally she didn't reveal the ending.
Yeah.
So I think it was in Scotland maybe, but when it was first performed, it ended with the killer being invited to step out from behind the curtain, and they played a recording, I think, of Agatha Christie's voice saying, I've given you all the information you need to be able to work out who it is, and blah, blah, blah.
And the groans rang out.
Can you imagine that? I'd be like, I bought a ticket. Like, I paid you to tell me the solution.
No, I think that would have been really exceptional. I mean, she's never done that before. We're always looking for the new twist.
It's an exciting idea.
Generally speaking, with a play, you want the audience to go home talking with whoever they went with about what they thought that was all about. And that's the ultimate kind of example of that. Having said that, the ending that we do get is also exceptional and horrific.
Yes.
I think it's amazing that the moment when the nurse steps out from behind the curtain, I had shivers, and I'm reading this at 60 years removed, and I'm not even experiencing the story in the way it's meant to be experienced. I'm reading a script. So we said it at the beginning, this idea that horror is everywhere now. It's just domestic.
Very much a Christie thing, though she returns to this idea. I was digging through, of course, my Agatha Christie interview archive, where I'm always trying to see what she might have to say about this week's topic.
I love it. You're such a little expert on this stuff. I can. No, it's perfect. I'll be like, did Christie ever mention buffaloes? And you'll be like, yes, let me find it. Da, 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 da. It's like, it's incredible.
And the thing is that there's also there's a hotline, because I've got people like John Curran and stuff as well, and Tony Medawar, who sometimes, if I'm like, I can't find something, it drives me mad.
Yes.
I can drop them a line, like, send up the, Agatha signal.
Yeah.
Somebody I'm sure I've seen this. Is there somewhere where we
did that
this?
literally 6 hours ago, didn't we? To John. Shout out to John. Hello, John.
Yes. Anyway, so this is something that Agatha Christie does talk about, because she was asked in an interview in the 60s about the murderers. Like, who do you pick to be your murderer, I guess? And she said, whoever my villain is, it has to be someone I feel could do the murder. A murderer must have the kind of nature which doesn't have any brakes on it. But this needn't be obvious to others. So this is interesting. So again, horror being hidden under the surface with somebody who superficially might seem to be a normal, nice neighbour. And there is some great examples of this in things like Halloween Party, I think is a really strong example. Halloween Party is a Poirot mystery novel in which a girl is drowned while apple bobbing from 1969. Of someone who absolutely, they're standing in society and the types of things that they're doing, it really doesn't feel like this person should be a murderer. And she goes on to say, when there's a murder, everyone seems so astonished. She's talking about this in real life now. People always say about the murderer, he was such a charming man, so kind, so good to children. Again, Halloween Party, interesting parallels here. Perhaps one day I shall meet a real one. I never have, so far as I know.
Do you know, it really flies in the face of anyone that thinks that Christie's characters aren't psychologically sophisticated, because it's clear the thought that she puts into not only who she makes the killer, but also how plausible that needs to be in order for her novels to work.
It is this puzzle thing again. And back to Halloween Party, the whole point of this is, could this person physically have been in the room to drown the victim? And if so, how does this work in terms of relationship to everybody else and the layout and all these sorts of things? And she absolutely nails that, but that is meaningless if we aren't psychologically convinced.
It's true.
And that's true of all of her people.
Yeah.
You can't just say, oh, well, this person's a murderer because, there actually was a secret door that they could get through. In order to, just opportunity is not enough.
It's not enough on its own, yeah. Actually, that's interesting. That makes me think of, because, there are so many passages in Halloween Party, to stay on that novel, where people are speculating that it was some kind of mad assailant that must have come in. And in a way, Christie's lampooning the idea that that would be the solution in one of her books. And therefore, by extension, kind of lampooning the idea that there is this feeling that escaped patients are sort of just roaming the streets, and that's the real threat. The real threat is the person you know.
Well, of course, this is Murder on the Orient Express, right? The convenient solution to Murder on the Orient Express is that it's not one of these 12 suspects, but that it is some person who's broken into the train in the middle of the snowbound nowhere and
leaving no
footprints and has committed this murder. Like, that's the convenient answer. That's what people want to be the truth, because that's much better than thinking it's a friend or it's a relative or whatever.
You're right. That follows Christie around throughout her career. But I wonder if what's different about the presentation of it in 60s books like Halloween Party is that because there's this moral panic and this sense of the world darkening around you.
Because we've got a real variety of villainy in the 60s as well, haven't we?
Yeah, I mean, take the seemingly innocent old lady Mrs. Lancaster in Pricking, who turns out to be absolutely diabolical, and we'll be coming on to her and her fascinating depiction and storyline later on in the episode. And another thing that struck me when you first said to me, horror's domestic, that's the difference. The Clocks is a Poirot novel about espionage and an unidentified body from 1963. The whole point is, as with many of Christie's novels, what an extraordinary thing to happen on an otherwise seemingly very ordinary street. The sort of street, in fact, that so many of her readers may well have lived on. And I don't know, it occurred to me, this is 3 years after Coronation Street starts. We're 1 year off Crossroads. Increasingly in mass entertainment, we're holding a mirror back to TV viewers in particular. And Christie's never been content with just depicting slice of life. She's always highlighted nastiness, the murder or the disruption or the disorder. So taken with that trend for 60s realism in mind, it actually situates The Clocks quite squarely in what's going on in popular culture, I think.
I really don't want this to sound like I'm any sort of apologist for murderers, but the idea that actually the murderous element is just a part of character, right? Like in Agatha Christie's books, it's not like murderers just spend their entire lives thinking, who am I going to kill? What's next? What am I going to get up to next? It could be villainous. And she has Ariadne Oliver talking about that in The Pale Horse, where she says, of course, I often have a master criminal in my stories. People like it, but really it gets harder and harder to do. So long as one doesn't know who he is, I can keep him impressive. But when it all comes out, he seems somehow so inadequate, a kind of anticlimax. It's much easier if you just have a bank manager who's embezzled the funds, or a husband who wants to get rid of his wife and marry the children's governess. So much more natural, if you know what I mean, which is just exactly this idea that these murderers, they are still going to the village fetes. They are still going to work. They're still raising children.
And it's so true. As you were saying that, I was thinking, I remember when John Curran, hello, because one of the things that the Secret Notebooks highlighted was the fact that Christie often changed her mind about who was going to be the killer throughout the planning process. There was a tendency in Christie fandom for a little while to talk about that as some kind of weakness. Like if it was really tightly plotted, then she would have known from the idea's genesis exactly what the arc was going to be. And actually there's something really, again, psychologically sophisticated and realistic, as you were saying, about maybe she's writing about ordinary people who sometimes get pushed to extraordinary lengths by certain situations that they find themselves in, certain grudges, certain temptations. And then it's unsurprising that it could be one of a number of characters who done it in a cast list, because any one of us theoretically could be, it's your man down the street theory all over again.
Yeah. One of the recurring motifs that we see in the 60s and then 70s is this thing about a child behind a fireplace, isn't there?
Yeah.
Yes, we were just saying before recording, that's genuinely really creepy.
It's a really, really disturbing image. And if it were Levin or Burgess or Jackson or like Stephen King even, it would be hailed as one of the kind of most impressive moments in the horror canon, but because it's Christie kind of tucked away in crime and not considered literary, it does sort of get passed over. But yeah, I mean, it's central to By the Pricking of My Thumbs, which we'll talk about in a minute. But she actually kind of unwittingly trails the idea in The Pale Horse at the start of the decade, and then even mentions again in a book published in the 70s.
Yeah, so in Sleeping Murder, which was written before these books in the 1960s, so that seems to be the first place that she integrated this idea.
It's not uncommon for these ideas to recur through a canon of throughout a writer's career. That's completely standard, but there is something so striking about this image, and I think, and actually the fact that it's pretty much confined, if we take Sleeping Murder out of the equation for a second, is pretty much confined to these 60s books, is also really significant for us. So in By the Pricking of My Thumbs...
By the Pricking of My Thumbs sees Tommy and Tuppence return to investigate a mystery at a nursing home from 1968.
So Tommy and Tuppence have gone to this nursing home to visit Tommy's aunt. Tuppence is speaking to another resident who is Mrs. Lancaster. And yeah, so I mean, it's worth quoting. So first, Mrs. Lancaster notices that Tuppence is looking at the fireplace. She's confused. Was I? And then Mrs. Lancaster says, "Excuse me, was it your poor child?" Tuppence, slightly taken aback, hesitated. No, I don't think so," she said. "I wondered. I thought perhaps you'd come for that reason. Someone ought to come sometime. Perhaps they will. And looking at the fireplace the way you did, that's where it is, behind the fireplace." It's incredibly chilling, and the language is so gentle and plain, which is true of a lot of Christie. She's very no frills, and that is one of the things that helps her create that tension, I think, in moments like this. I think centering this image is at paying due diligence to the how seismic that theme is.
And it's this thing about when Tuppence wants to find out a bit more about it, she asks around, and someone else just blames the television. Says, "Oh, it's probably the TV giving her ideas," rather than
I forgot about that.
this. Yeah, so the things they think up, it's the TV that gives them the ideas. Yeah, of course it is. Yes, let's blame television.
Yeah. But then there's that incredibly creepy dream sequence when Tuppence is obviously disturbed by this, as you would be, and when she's drifting off to sleep after she's spoken to Mrs. Lancaster, we get all sorts of horrific imaginings: dead children, too many dead children, the child's doll, a child that had been killed by a demented young girl, driven off her rather weak brains by the fact that her lover had deserted her, all such a muddle, the chronology all fixed up, a scratching noise coming from the chimney, blows were coming from behind a great iron plate nailed up there, the clanging sounds of a hammer, clang, clang, clang. Tuppence woke up. It was Mrs. Copley knocking on the door. Again, it's really powerful stuff, isn't it? And we should say, so the reference to the doll, so when she does then she then ends up in this slightly Hansel and Gretel-y cottage. It's a long story. And reaches into the fireplace and has this feeling about this fireplace, having been kind of following the trail of this story so far, reaches into this fireplace and pulls out a doll, which again it's a great subversion, because it's not what you're expecting, and you're slightly relieved that it isn't what Mrs. Lancaster made you believe might be behind there.
Yeah.
But it also is as good as, because it's saying that is probably what was there, because of this is a sign. It's playing with two very domestic symbols, the fireplace and the child's toy, that shouldn't be together, and putting them together is inherently horrific. It's really strong stuff.
And she obviously felt that this was a particularly atmospheric image, because it pops up in The Pale Horse several years earlier. And Pale Horse, of course, is so much about atmosphere, not just for us as a reader, but the fact that the characters are creating an atmosphere. Like, this is an important part of the story, is there something genuinely supernatural going on, or might there be a more sort of
doubting reality. Yeah, absolutely.
There's a bit where, so Mark Easterbrook, who's our narrator for much of it, his friend David talks to him and says, says, I remember being sent once with a message to a doctor at a mental home, and I was shown into a room to wait, and there was a nice elderly lady there, sipping a glass of milk. She made some conventional remark about the weather, and then suddenly she leant forward and asked in a low voice, is it your poor child who's buried there behind the fireplace? And then she nodded her head and said, 12:10 exactly. It's always at the same time every day. Pretend you didn't notice the blood.
Yeah.
And then, was there really someone buried behind the fireplace? Poppy wanted to know, another character. David ignored her. So we don't actually know.
It's left hanging, isn't it? It's left hanging until by the pricking of my thumbs. And it's funny because one of the things that, again, there's a kind of perception among some Christie readers, I think, that maybe it's slightly unfortunate that some of Christie's ideas crop up again in weird little kind of cul-de-sacs like this, because it's kind of like a continuity error. But I mean, there's nothing to say that the nice elderly lady that we're hearing about wasn't Mrs. Lancaster.
Yeah.
You know,
and I guess
the Christie verse is real.
Well, yes. And but also this whole thing's thrown into disarray by our endless question of when was Sleeping Murder written, but definitely before this, because that, of course, is definitely our earliest written version of this, or the earliest version in our completed stories. Gwenda, who's our sort of protagonist for much of it, gets again someone saying to her, is it your poor child, my dear? And Gwenda looked slightly taken aback. She said doubtfully, no, it isn't. Ah, I wondered. The old lady nodded her head and sipped her milk. Then she said conversationally, 10:30, that's the time. It's always at 10:30. Most remarkable. She lowered her voice and leaned forward again. Behind the fireplace, she breathed. But don't say I told you. Again, it doesn't actually really go anywhere. It's sort of there for atmosphere. It's only in By the Pricking of My Thumbs that we get some sort of resolution to what this might mean.
I like it. It's such a powerful image that it's almost permeating, and then it's finally allowed to come forth and own a novel. And I think it's probably testament to Christie's skill as a writer by this point, a very experienced writer by this point. She knows where there's an idea that could carry a novel, and she knows where there's something that realistically is only a short story, or realistically is, not worth pursuing. And this is something that absolutely makes what is in many ways an exceptional novel. So whilst it's true to say that we have this new modern take on horror to some extent coming through, this kind of domestic, as you said, the kind of creepy man down the street style horror, that's not to say that the traditional oldie worldy folklore style horror has completely gone away. In fact, Christie, as we'll see now, does use that throughout these 60 books, doesn't she, as a supplementary horror to add
simmering in the background.
Absolutely, sort of, hubble bubble. Yeah, in fact, there's even, it's explicitly said in The Pale Horse, there's still a witch in every village in rural England. There's this sense that it still exists, and it's out there in these creepy little pockets, and her books kind of seek these, especially these 60s books like Pale Horse Pricking, seek those witches out. So she contrasts old-fashioned style horror tropes with modernity, doesn't she? So there's the opening sequence to The Pale Horse, which we've already talked about, the kind of startling modernity of that with the espresso machine hissing. Yeah. And the metaphor that she uses is the espresso machine is devilish. And then the passage ends with her saying it's a dangerous world. And there's a bit as well, I think you pulled this out, that whilst Ariadne Oliver is advocating the idea of horror being all around, horror being domestic, she nevertheless links it back to folklore by saying, of course, I was brought up on the devil. She says it apologetically, believing in him, but he always did seem to me so silly with hooves and a tail and all that. It's like we're kind of debunking old-fashioned horror, but we're also not. It's also very present through these books. And the imagery of pagan traditions and curses and those traditional Anglo-Saxon or pagan country practices, looking to the untrained eye or to the urbane eye, quite sinister.
Well, it's powerful even if you don't believe in it. Yeah. And she's had this idea way back in the 1920s when she did a Poirot short story about the event of the Egyptian tomb, where the power of supernatural, Poirot says, supernatural is very powerful, but not because he believes in it, but because if you believe in it, if I can convince you that you are cursed, for example, then that is a really powerful psychological thing.
Yeah, it's always been there. And I think think, I guess the difference now in these books is that she's offsetting it against this new 60s horror tradition that's coming in.
Yeah.
But all of the Pale Horse does this. I mean, the obfuscation is it's a curse, and the solution is it comes down to science. It comes down to thallium. It comes down to a poison. But she plays with the speculation in the run-up. There's, do you think it's possible to kill someone by remote control? And Mark says, press a button and set off a radioactive death ray. Ariadne replies, no, not science fiction. I really mean black magic. The irony being of the solution does fall on the side of science rather than superstition. And we're setting up this binary kind of early in the book, but also tying into very contemporary fears about pressing the button and blowing up the world.
Yeah.
I mean, that's prevalent through this time, and this is something that is a huge topic, isn't it? And we've got a whole episode dedicated to Armageddon coming up.
Yeah. But this thing about people just having an idea of something that they don't completely understand, she ties it in with, as you say, science, because Mark says the trance and the white cocks and the brazier and the pentagrams and the voodoo and the reverse crucifix, all these traditions of black magic, all that hooey, he calls it. He says, we don't believe in spirits and witches and spells nowadays, but we're a gullible lot when it comes to rays and waves and psychological phenomena. You know, people can be cajoled into believing in something that they don't necessarily
But what they believe
understand.
in now is different.
Yes.
The point being, that what's taken the place of that superstition is a new kind of thinking, which is scientific.
Yes.
And he's kind of equally dismissive of both, I guess, which is an interesting quirk of the character.
You know, the different types of murder come up in the Pale Horse. And David, who's Mark's friend, talks to Hermia, who's Mark's girlfriend at the beginning of the book. It says how convenient it must have been in the past to be able to call up a handy murderer whenever you wanted a little job done. And we'll come back to this sort of gangster idea a little bit later on. But what I mean was not gangsterdom, not racketeers or crime barons, just ordinary everyday folk who want to get rid of someone. How convenient if you could ring up Harrods and say, please send along 2 good murderers, will you? So, this idea of murder being on demand somehow, whether through superstition, just, go through to the Assassination Bureau and get whatever you need.
I'm surprised she didn't say Army and Navy stores.
She
loves
find
the Army and
everything
Navy
at the
stores.
Army and Navy
It's
store.
true.
Yeah,
famously.
yeah.
No, again, it's the modern translation of folklore and superstition in Christie's reckoning, it seems a lot of the time, and in the minds of several of her characters, is kind of organised crime. I picked out this passage where Mark is talking about his girlfriend, Hermia, as you say at the start of the book. He says the darkness of the Pale Horse, the lightness that Hermia represented, good, everyday, sensible light, the electric light bulb firmly fixed in its socket, illuminating all the dark corners. It's so literary because Hermia is representing sense and modernity to some extent. She's young. We found her in the coffee bar scene as we find Mark. And yet he's also aware that she doesn't quite belong in this world that he's stepping into. So much of the Pale Horse is powerful because it does feel, and pricking of my thumbs feels like this as well, like you're being coaxed into a world that's not quite the world that we expect to find in an Agatha Christie book.
And we've got the 3 witches in the Pale Horse, which
course.
of course is our Macbeth reference, which she comes back to several times.
Yeah, and this comes from... Christie has said years ago that the way you should do the 3 witches is 3 ordinary women.
She says that a couple of times, it's including in the 60s. But yes, it's something that comes up again, which is this idea that,
and women, that's the creepiest way to depict them. And also the most powerful. That's the idea that clearly appeals to her, and that's the one that she's chosen to run with in the Pale Horse.
And a modern theatre way to stage it, of course. That's exactly how
she's ahead of her time. That's what the RSC would do today. Or do.
Yeah. There's a seance, isn't there, that we see with lots of
Yeah.
atmosphere, even whether we're meant to believe that this is really... Because the thing about the Pale Horse is that it's not clear whether we're meant to believe it's a supernatural story, because she did write supernatural stories, but generally not as novels, just as short stories. So you're reading it thinking, has she actually gone for a story about witches and how you defeat witches?
That's so true, actually. I hadn't thought of that, but it plays with the reader on a meta level, and it depends what kind of Christie follower you are. Get different things coming to the Pale Horse. If you know know, like we do, the deep dive that she has dabbled in the supernatural at times, you get that reading. If you're less familiar with her canon, maybe you think this is just what she does. You know, do Poirot and Marple fight the supernatural as well as the villain? You know, it's.
Well, we were really thinking about that when we watched The Pale Horse, the ITV one.
Yeah.
And we really enjoyed the opening. And then about halfway through, I think you turned to me and said, can you imagine just seeing that Agatha Christie's The Pale Horse and thinking, oh, it's just really a normal
see that
mystery.
in the Radio Times.
Bearing in mind that like Poirot was far and away the most, at that time, the most famous way that you could watch Agatha Christie, and it's on the same network. And so sitting and watching The Pale Horse and going, what's this? Like there's witches and there's curses and all this sort of stuff going on.
And not a butler in sight.
Not a butler in sight.
But I like this sense that what's going on is just a bit nebulous. It's just slightly beyond our comprehension. And again, I know I bang on about this a lot, but I do think that Christie's late style gets a bit of an unfair treatment in terms of being unintentionally confusing, but I would argue she often engages with genres like the supernatural on some level to obfuscate, and it's deliberate. This confusion, this feeling of smog surrounding you is deliberate.
And this thing again about it being the fear that's important, and that even when the power of witches is dismissed as, you know, being old-fashioned, there's still this thing about how, but maybe you better not. Better not cross them just in case. David says in The Pale Horse that, for example, if there's someone you suspect of being a witch in a village, maybe a Mrs. Black, if you get across her, your cows will stop giving milk, your potato crop will fail, or little Johnny will twist his ankle. You must keep on the right side of old Mrs. Black. Nobody says so outright, but they all know. So he's saying it's not just, in this particular village where Pale Horse takes place, but that you can find that all the way across the country.
Yeah, you can imagine him sort of going, ooh, like I think he's kind of sending it up, but he's also, the point that Christie's making behind it is not being sent up, if that makes sense. There's layers to it. And then Endless Night, of course, uses so many classic horror tropes.
Endless Night is a standalone psychological thriller in which young couple Michael and Ellie are menaced by unusual happenings. It's from 1967. There's another possible witch type character in the background. Again, like The Pale Horse, that it's the locals, that there's just this sinister thing about you've got to be careful, especially if you're an outsider coming here, that the locals are going to know stuff that maybe they can't prove, but just saying to you, be careful about the types of people who you're crossing and you're speaking to. And there is just this underlying suspense. I mean, the whole point of Endless Night as a novel is you think someone seems to be out to get them. And who could it be? Is it a local who's, throwing things at their house and seems to be doing all sorts of maybe supernatural type stuff, but more likely perhaps just engineering stuff to make them be very, very unlucky and unfortunate.
And the solution being that it's not the outsider, it's the threat inside all along. Yeah, completely.
The call is coming from inside the house.
Yeah, we've made the point before that Endless Night is a bit of a weird, but it's an amazing book, but it's a bit of a weird book because you do get to a certain point and you're still kind of wondering what the point is. Yeah. It's quite late in the day that you really find out what the point of it all was. And arguably, Christie uses the classic genre horror framework to keep you reading, which is really clever.
Because there's loads of things that it invokes, doesn't it, about superstitions. There's this evil eye business that's referred to at one point.
Threats, warnings, evil eye business. And we'll come back to that amazing and, again, classic horror image of the evil eye in A Caribbean Mystery in a minute.
But she's using these as a bit of shorthand because, as I've said before, these aren't long books, right? There are loads of characters you've got to get to know really quickly and lots of atmosphere to build and lots of plot to get through. So by invoking these sort of memories that we have of other things that we've read or seen, she gets us immediately to understand what she's getting at.
Yeah, completely. But she's also not above subverting genre tropes, is she? And that's one of the things that makes her so deceptively clever. Like, one of the things that really struck me about Endless Night is that it would be the easiest thing in the world to just have the old haunted house. But she doesn't. She tears the old haunted house down and then builds in its place a sparklingly modern house.
Yes.
And actually, the twist at the end of the book is it's the sparkling modern house that contains the real horror. That's a really potent thing to centre the book around.
Yeah. And that this private witch is actually being paid to pretend to be a witch. That's what we sort of get. So she is actually on commission, but more of like an actor's commission than a witch commission to just sort of come and spook people. Because Mike talks to Santonix, the architect, doesn't he? He says, we've got gypsies who jump out from behind trees and shake fists at us and warn us that if we don't get out of here, some awful fate will happen to us. This place that ought to be good and beautiful. But actually, Mike knows it's never really going to be that, because he's the person behind ensuring that actually it's going to be a place of, devastation.
Which Christie hangs a hat on because it goes on. They were queer words to say, those last ones. I said them as though it was somebody else saying them. She's literally saying, I just gave you a red herring there because it's me. I'm the problem. It's so clever when you reread it.
And Santonix seems to be on to Mike. Like, he's sort of
in between passionate sessions with him.
Absolutely. Gosh.
Hashtag Santonix is gay. Get it trending. And then, by the pricking of my thumbs, another vintage horror in so many ways. In fact, could we argue that it's a retelling of Hansel and Gretel? Is it a modern Hansel and Gretel? It certainly engages in a lot of the images from that story.
It explicitly engages with it. But again, it does it in the sense of saying, oh, this feels like a witch, and then immediately tells you it's not. But then still has its cake and eat it by saying that, oh, but maybe she sort of is a witch. So...
I love that. You're so right. Has a cake and eat it, because you can imagine her writing into that going, I'll show them with this one. It's so I love it. She's so clever.
So because we have Tuppence going to find out about this house, and she sees this woman we learn is called Alice Perry, and we're told the door of the house had opened and a woman came out. She put down a milk bottle and then
sinister milk again. We're coming back to this. But hold that thought.
Why, it's a friendly witch. What an amazing thing to immediately think. It was a woman of about 50. She had long straggly hair, which when caught by the wind flew out behind her. It reminded Tuppence vaguely of a picture of a young witch on a broomstick. That is perhaps why the term witch had come into her mind. But there was nothing young or beautiful about this woman. She was middle-aged, with a lined face, dressed in a rather slipshod way. She had a kind of steeple hat perched on her head, and her nose and her chin came up towards each other. As a description, she could have been sinister, but she did not look sinister. She seemed to have a beaming and boundless goodwill. Yes, thought Tuppence. Of course, we find out later that Mrs. Perry, she's dressing up because they're putting a play on. Like, that's why she's got the hat on.
Yeah.
So... But even with the hat off, she's saying, oh, I still feel that you seem a little bit witchy.
And that's when Tuppence explicitly says, ultimately, she isn't the witch of the story. The witch of the story is Mrs. Lancaster. Yes. Do you know what I mean? That's the trickery that's going on in the plot mechanics. Alice Perry's husband, Amos, is the one who has been suspected of these child murders that have been going on for years. And we get a mention that he is maybe not fully competent mentally. And that leads us quite neatly on, I think, to talk about quite a sensitive issue and quite a harrowing issue, which is explored in several of these books, which is the link between horror as genre, as storytelling mode, and insanity, the insanity that drives people to kill, and just what was going on in terms of mental health in the 60s generally. Obviously, mental health is a bit of an anachronistic term, but talking from a modern day perspective, we wouldn't be the first people to observe that crime fiction is all about the moment of disorder within an ordered world and the retention of order at the end, or certainly that's a very compelling reading. And there is something inherently disordered, it's disordered thinking. The madness kind of rucks up the story. And I noticed a section in The Pale Horse where Mark is talking about kind of panto villains rather than real life villainy. And he says, it was instability attacking stability, and in the end I thought stability will always win. And I just thought, isn't that just a microcosm for the way that these books function?
Well, there is evidence of some cynicism about psychiatry generally in a few of these books. In The Pale Horse, the police surgeon, Dr. Corrigan, says, I'm not a psychiatrist. Strictly between you and me, I think half these fellows are slightly balmy themselves. They're punch drunk on theories, and they go much too far.
Yeah, it's an interesting... I mean, that's quite galling to think about. The mad people are the people that are calling people mad themselves. And I think that's supposed to add to the all-round bleakness and tension of the book. I mean, that's very much in Dr. Corrigan's portrayal as well, isn't it? Like within his character.
Yeah.
Yeah, we get perhaps slightly more sympathetically, we get Tuppence in By the Pricking of My Thumbs, sort of trying and failing in a way to understand the insane criminal mind. And she thinks, why do they want to kill children? What gives them that urge? Are they sorry about it afterwards? Are they disgusted? Are they desperately unhappy? Are they terrified? I think anyone that doubts Christie's ability to show the emotional lives of her characters should read passages like that, because I actually think that is revealing in terms of Tuppence's motivation for unravelling this mystery, how Tuppence feels about what's going on.
When you read these in order, you see the same some of the same ideas recurring, which is not unusual. And one thing that Agatha Christie talks about several times in several books is this idea of patients being let out, in sort of quotation marks, from what at the time were called asylums. And in The Clocks, for example, one character, Mr. Bland, when he's being interviewed, says, the trouble is they let all these balmy people out of lunatic asylums nowadays, send them home on parole or whatever they call it. Then they do in someone else. So this idea that people are being released.
Which I think is a lot of, based on the research that I've done, there is a whipping up of this in the press, and I'm not sure how true it is. I think it's part of the kind of ongoing moral panic. But it's certainly something that Christie seems preoccupied by. And yeah, it is something she comes back to.
Halloween Party is another one, that there is a perception in it that, again quoting, our mental homes are too full, overcrowded, so doctors say, and that in the past we had our mentally disturbed, or whatever they call them, but not so many as we have now. So again, this cynicism about, or there's this sense that things are getting worse in the 60s.
I wonder if it's misplaced cynicism slightly as well, because there's a feeling that bad things within society, but it's also kind of victim blaming. And I don't know if that's really the point. Again, I'm not equating this to how Christie feels, because so much of this is in dialogue of characters that actually we're not really supposed to sympathise with.
No. Dr. Ferguson in Halloween Party says, with children being killed nowadays, you don't need to look for the reasons. In other words, don't keep checking for motives and everything. The reason's in another place. The reason's in the killer's mind, his disturbed mind, or his evil mind, or his kinky mind. So again, this idea that it's maybe more palatable in a way for people to say it is this external force that we cannot control.
That's fascinating, actually. It's kind of a debunking of what Christie's built a career on. If we're not looking for the reason, if we're no longer looking for the reason because it is all just, the answer every time is just they were mad. Exactly. Then there's kind of no call for the crime fiction of the sort that Christie's been writing. And maybe is that partly why Christie's books do skew later on towards, not that there's not psychological sophistication in the earlier ones, but there is maybe more of a sense of the emotional lives of the characters and less emphasis on tight puzzle plotting. Is that because of what Dr. Ferguson says, because there's less call for that now, because now the emphasis in society in these books is on the psychology?
In terms of characters who we're perhaps familiar with and their perspectives on it, Ariadne Oliver in Halloween Party, when speculating that perhaps a child might have committed the murder, says children do queer things sometimes. I mean, there are queer children about. Children who, well, once I suppose they would have been in mental homes and things, but they send them home now and tell them to lead ordinary lives or something, and then they go and do something like this. Of course, they don't come and do something like this. Not in Halloween Party.
No, because the person that does it is Rowena Drake and Michael Garfield. And that's interesting, because this is the next quote that we've pulled out, is Rowena Drake's direct kind of deflecting of the responsibility when she's talking to Poirot. It's such a brilliant red herring. She wants him and the rest of the characters in the book to follow this line of thinking that the answer is madness. Don't ask any more questions. It certainly wasn't me. It's nothing to do with me. She says, there are sad fatalities with children all over the countryside. They seem to be getting more and more frequent. Mental instability seems to be on the increase, though I must say that mothers and families generally are not looking after their children properly as they used to do. Well, she did not look after a child properly. She did something terrible to a child. Children are sent home from school alone on dark evenings. Again, you have this sense of, the decade's drawing to a close, the nights are drawing in, we've got a new celebration in the winter calendar that's coming to prominence that's about bringing light to dark evenings. A Halloween party as a kind of bundle of themes. It's all coming together here. And it's evil. It's really on the other side of knowing what happens in the book. One of the main examples in this area is Molly's story in A Caribbean Mystery.
A Caribbean Mystery is a Miss Marple novel about a murder on the fictional island of Saint Honoré from 1964.
Molly's changed. She's changed out of all seeming. She's having bad dreams. She has blackouts. Dr. Graham says, I advise you most strongly to take your wife to see a good specialist. Now, don't be upset by labels. A neurologist, a psychologist, someone who specialises in what the layman calls nervous breakdowns. And then we're sort of drip fed this. And then we are later told there was trouble of that kind in Molly's family, meaning some kind of inherited insanity. I mean, a history of, she chose the word carefully, instability. And then Tim, who's Molly's husband, says these things aren't hereditary. Everyone knows that nowadays. It's an exploded idea. Molly's perfectly sane. It's just that, I believe it was that wretched old Palgrave dying that started it all off. And Tim's actually being quite fair there, unlike Rowena Drake, as he is the murderer.
Yes.
And he's...
You can't just blame that. You can't just
say... but actually he does want... That's a double bluff, isn't it? He does want us to believe that she's mad. He's poisoning her with belladonna and also essentially gaslighting her.
Yeah.
And gaslighting us and the characters into believing that Molly's mad, but what's going on is actually part of the murder plot. But madness is this veneer, madness is this changeable mask, which leads us neatly on. I know, I'm doing excellently with the segues today, aren't I? These sort of scales falling from your eyes, the mask slips, and what you see behind it in the killer's face is madness at the denouement of a Christie book. That's not exclusive to the 60s, is it? But we do see it in the 60s.
Yeah, in ways that actually are quite startling and I think make a really strong impression on the reader. In The Pale Horse, just when our murderer, Mr. Osborne, is just being revealed and the inspector says, why, if you just sat back in that shop of yours and let well alone, I shouldn't be here now warning you, as it's my duty to do, that anything you say will be taken down. And it was then that Mr. Osborne began to scream. It's the end of chapter. So this respectable pharmacist who's, it's been used as a key witness throughout this whole story because why would he lie? And snap.
And actually, the end of the penultimate chapter in A Caribbean Mystery, so the same kind of point of the structure of Pale Horse, we get something similarly horrific. We get just as Marple's figuring it out. We're not told what's happened yet. All we get is the evil eye ... I ... and then italicized I, and it feels quite trippy. It's really, and it's emphasizing, and if you're a reader that's been paying attention, then you can use that emphasis to work out the glass eye is the crucial clue, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it links it also to this classic horror symbol of the evil eye that's bringing bad luck.
Yeah, and one of the really striking ones again is in Endless Night.
Oh God, yeah.
Where, because
like the fodder of nightmares.
Because we've read this whole book and the narrators, we've been in his mind, in Mike's mind, and at the end, we are sort of first-hand witnesses to how he snaps.
To it unraveling, yeah.
Yeah, so when he's speaking to Greta, who he's been in cahoots with, we feel and we're told that Mike is really turning. We're told that he says to Greta, I loved her. Yes, I loved her still with a last tense sexual desire. But love, hate, desire, aren't they all the same? 3 and 1 and 1 and 3. I could never have hated Ellie, but I hated Greta. I enjoyed hating her. I hated her with all my heart and with a leaping, joyous wish. I couldn't wait for the safe ways. I didn't want to wait for them. I came nearer to her.
I couldn't wait for the safe way. He means he'd planned to kill her in a sensible way and cover it up in the future. But he's so, at this point, he's losing it so much that he's just going to kill her now. I mean, that's the ultimate unraveling, isn't it? And then I think what's really harrowing about all this is that he uses this violent misogynistic language And that's Christie's way of telling us he's really lost it now. It's gone from love all the way to the opposite end of the spectrum. Have you got that quote?
Yeah, I mean, I almost don't want to read it, but I came nearer to her. "You filthy bitch," I said. "You hateful, glorious, golden-haired bitch. You're not safe, Greta. You're not safe from me. Do you understand? I've learned to enjoy killing people. I want more than pushing an old woman over a quarry. I want to use my hands," and that's in italics.
Yeah. So again, it's the end of the kind of penultimate chapter.
Yeah.
Just another thing to praise Christie for. She's so brilliant with structure, because all three of these examples we've looked at so far, it's just the lip at the end of the kind of falling action, which is just classic storytelling construction. I was struck when we talked about the rats, we were saying that in many ways it feels like a perversion of the classic Christie story. And similarly, it's not a classic Christie story in the sense that the scales fall from our eyes with one of those characters and they descend into madness. They both do. Those last few lines, they're both going absolutely wild and they're both saying vile things to each other. And again, there's misogynistic language thrown in there from Alec. And yeah, it's almost like this is like the killer breakdown at the end of a Christie times 2. You know?
This thing of the mask slipping from unexpected characters, I guess in Endless Night we get that because it's a narrator, but in By the Pricking My Thumbs we get it because it's the nice dotty old lady. Tuppence says she doesn't look mad, she's a perfectly normal, reasonable human being. And then we were going through this earlier in preparation for this episode, and there is so much.
The last few pages, again, are really amazingly written and really hard to read. Yeah. And the showdown with the villain and the explanation for her crimes is quite horrible.
Mrs. Lancaster says, "I had to obey the commands given me. There have to be agents of destruction. They go free of sin, you see. I mean, the children went free of sin. So the children she's killed went free of sin. They were not old enough to sin, so I sent them to glory, as I was appointed to do. Still innocent, still not knowing evil. You can see what a great honour it was to be chosen, to be one of the specially chosen. I always loved children. I had none of my own."
God, yeah. Horrible. And we continue to get an insight into her kind of twisted thinking, which is that she says, "And you could only atone for murder with other murders." That's why she's done what she's done. And as part of the explanation for her crimes, we find out about her past. It's funny, she's quite a similar figure to Bess Sedgwick at Bertram's Hotel, in the sense that they both talk about having led these extraordinary lives with dark undercurrents as well. I was involved in all that sort of thing, gangs, big robberies. It has such an appeal for one when one is young. She was Killer Kate, wasn't she? Was her sort of name. One thinks being a gunman's mole would be the most wonderful thing in the world. I thought so once. Believe me." She leaned forward and tapped Tuppence on the knee. "Believe me, it's not true. It isn't really. I thought so once, but one wants more than that, you know. There's no thrill really in just stealing things and getting away with it. It needs good organisation, of course. I've really had a very interesting life, eventful. I was a wild girl and I was mixed up with, well, really just a common gang of criminals." I think it's really fascinating the way that the thriller plot that's vaguely threaded through Pricking, although it's quite minor, these mentions of organised criminality, it crashes into these horror tropes at this point, and it just goes to show how Christie engages with so many more genres than just your golden age crime fiction, and she's playing with the tension of the two of them rubbing up against each other there.
Yeah, and it's interesting to say about Bess Sedgwick, who at the end of At Bertram's Hotel, there's a sudden moment of unexpected physicality when she goes, "Catch me if you can," and runs outside.
Yeah.
Goes through a window and over the roof or whatever, up a drain pipe. We get that from Mrs. Lancaster. Suddenly, physically, her presence is completely unexpected.
Becomes terrifying.
Tuppence basically can't escape from this situation. "What a silly woman you are," Mrs. Lancaster says to her, "to want it this way." Her left arm shot out and she caught Tuppence's shoulder. Her right hand came from behind her back. In it was a long, thin stiletto blade. Again, the sort of thing that organised crime, gangs, Chicago gangs and stuff would have a stiletto blade. Tuppence struggled. She thought, "I can stop her easily. She's an old woman, feeble." Suddenly, in a cold tide of fear, she thought, "But I'm an old woman too." The gleaming blade was approaching her. Tuppence screamed. I mean, that's proper horror film. That's like end of Halloween type stuff, It's well ahead of its time. It's very Psycho, in fact.
Dizziness and limpness submerged her. Her muscles relaxed. Somewhere there was a great crash of broken glass. It swept her away into darkness and unconsciousness. It's visceral in the way it feels like a horror, you know, that you can imagine in the cinema, the glass smashing as the picture slowly fades to black. It's another kind of difficult topic, but we do have to talk about suicide. There are depictions of the act of taking one's life in Christie, and especially in the 60s books. You know, sadly, it is something that's very much in the air in early 60s British society. Laura Thompson, one of the main kind of biographers of Christie, and I was rereading her book for this podcast, and she does make reference to Peg, who was Archie's mother, so Christie's first husband, Archie, was volatile in the extreme, and in 1963 her younger son Campbell would be found dead in his gas-filled kitchen. We know that Christie didn't have a huge amount of contact with Archie anymore, but it leapt out at me because that is the year that Sylvia Plath sadly commits suicide. And there's another, I was thinking about, there's a really powerful book called Woman on the Edge of Time, which is written by Jeremy Gavron, and it talks about his mother, Hannah, and her suicide, which was just 2 years after Sylvia Plath's and just 2 streets away. And again, it's, I guess, because the technology of the way that a kitchen is and living environments mean that people can do this in this time. I'm not for a second suggesting that suicide is a uniquely early 60s phenomena, but there is something in the air about this. And Sylvia Plath, of course, published The Bell Jar just before her death. It went out under a pseudonym, but The Bell Jar being a really ahead of its time exploration of what we would now call mental health, is quite autobiographical. And the titular bell jar refers to Esther feeling like wherever I sat, on the deck of a ship or at a street cafe in Paris or Bangkok, I would be sitting under the same glass bell jar, stewing in my own sour air. You know, this feeling that you can't escape your thoughts. I'm sure many of us can, I certainly can relate to that kind of darkness within. And I just also want to make one further link, which is that Frostquake, which is a historical source that we've been using quite a lot through this project, actually takes from Sylvia Plath. It uses the quote, "Well, I know now. I know a little more how much a simple thing like snowfall can mean to a person." And Frostquake, of course, is about the big freeze of 62 to 63. And I think there is this feeling that Sylvia Plath dies in this very winter, this horrendous winter of 62 to 63, one of the coldest Britain has ever known. It's claustrophobic, it clogs your lungs, there's smog, it's treacherous ice, and there are blizzards, and I'm pulling all this from Juliet Nicholson. Everything came to a halt and people died, and it was really harrowing. It's like a horrorscape, you know. Let's not forget that this is the backdrop against which Sylvia Plath is writing and living and sadly dying, and this is the backdrop against Christie. Christie is writing through this time as well. It's a really apocalyptic environment, and there were so many things in society that were making people feel this way, as well as, I guess, the way that society was talking about insanity changing so that people were talking about it more generally.
So perhaps this is on Christie's mind a bit, because Major Palgrave tells a story about a wife giving her husband a sleeping draught, and then, as he says it, stuck him in a gas oven. Resourceful female. Then she said it was suicide. She got off quite lightly. Diminished responsibility. That's what it's called nowadays.
And this is only, she was writing that, what, a year after both?
Yeah, it would have been over winter
both
63,
Campbell and
64, yeah.
Well, it's no surprise that she wanted to imagine Miss Marple jetting off to sunnier climes in that
I hadn't thought of that.
Really cold, awful backdrop. But yeah, and just to close that, we've got In a Northern Wind by David Kynaston. He gives us some context to what's going on in terms of mental health, and he says, you know, there is a fundamental shift in the provision of mental health care. It was actually progressing, and maybe because it's advancing, it's in the news more, and maybe that's why writers like Christie are more aware of it and responding to it. We have the Mental Health Act of 1959, which developed mental health services within the community. Local authorities have greater powers. It's definitely a concern within society. So Christie, it's often said, very much belongs to the golden age, quote-unquote, cozy school of detective fiction. There's the other main school throughout most of her writing life, which is the hard-boiled, more noir, more horror, just generally kind of darker school. And one of the things that we want to debunk, and one of the things we often talk about just as Christie fans, is that she does have a lot of dark elements. And, you know, a lot of fans have a chip on their shoulder, as we do, about Christie not being nearly as cozy as your average reader thinks she is. But, you know, this is interesting in the 60s because although we've got the big hitters of the hard-boiled school, which was predominantly an American trend as well, it's worth saying, although those big hitters like Hammett and Chandler were at their height in the 30s, 40s, 50s, their paperbacks are still widely in circulation. And actually the 50s and 60s is the period where Pan and Fontana are releasing Christie books with these quite pulpy, often lurid yellow, which we've talked about, covers that seem to be trying to align her in that school rather than something a bit fluffier. And you made the point about the clocks.
Oh yes, Geraldine, who is in a block of flats looking down and observing society because she's injured at home. And that's Rear Window. I mean, that's Hitchcock's Rear Window in the 50s. It's very much about looking out of a normal flat and seeing that actually if you observe for long enough, you start to see the horrors of society. And in both cases, a murder, actually. But
do you know, that's interesting. I just thought, because we know that Hitchcock was inspired by writers like Daphne du Maurier, who are not a million miles away from Christie at all. I wonder if he was inspired by Christie. I mean, is there overlap?
Yes. It's in Agatha Christie on screen.
I remember. For the listener, I love that book, but I did say to you yesterday, it has been like 5 years since I've read it now. So
and you don't remember every last fact?
No, that would be difficult. I did go back through it when we were researching for this podcast, but I only looked at 60s things.
It's really, it might even just be a footnote comment because it's just throwaway that Hitchcock was always on the lookout for potential new projects, things that he could film, and they sent him details of Witness for the Prosecution and Dial M for Murder. It's also running, and he went for Dial M for Murder. So Witness for the Prosecution was sort of wafted under his nose a little bit.
Interesting.
But he didn't take it. And Accident, the short story, was requested to be one of the Alfred. He didn't have a huge amount to do with Alfred Hitchcock Presents, the anthology TV series. He presented and he directed a few, but they did ask for that to be an episode, and that was declined. This was in the MGM sort of
interesting.
Era, so
but there are real Hitchcockian elements to several of Christie's plot, and she talks about hard-boiled detective fiction in a few interviews of the period, doesn't she?
Yeah, there's one towards the end of the decade where she's talking about the type of murder stories that she wants to write. I don't like messy deaths. Anyway, I'm more interested in peaceful people who die in their beds and no one knows why. I don't like violence.
But as we've seen, I mean, there are quite a lot of violent deaths in Christie, and we've talked about her self-deprecation before, but there is an element of that. And also, I think this is true of many writers, not just Christie. It's probably true of both of us, actually. You, as the person themselves, is not the best at seeing their own merits.
Yes, but in terms of this violence, there's another interview where she says, I dislike thrillers with only violence. Half of it is sadistic, not imaginative or inventive. And actually, that end of, say, Pricking My Thumbs, that is imaginative and inventive because it's an older lady, you know, doing this.
In a gingerbread house.
In a gingerbread house, yeah. So she says, I avoid violence where possible. It would be unpleasant to me and I should not like to read it. It's like being forced to go into a theatre to see an operation.
Yes. I remember you quote this in your book, Agatha Christie's Poirot. I do remember that.
Wow, well done. I don't remember that. I have to colour code it to see which quotes I've used before as I work through it. But she also says in yet another interview, modern taste. So modern taste, this is important. She's not writing in a vacuum. She's thinking about what are people interested in.
Yeah.
She knows. She says modern taste has changed very largely from detective stories to crime stories, what are known in America as gabblers, just a series of violent episodes succeeding each other. I find those very boring.
Yeah,
so do I, Agatha.
And yet, like I say, several of these 60s books do have kind of hard-boiled or noirish elements. There's a little moment that stuck out to me in Passenger to Frankfurt.
Passenger to Frankfurt is a standalone espionage thriller about Sir Stafford Nye's hunt for answers from 1970.
It which is Stafford Nye turned up the collar of his Macintosh and plodded on in the rain, essentially. And that is the classic noir image. That's Humphrey Bogart.
That is.
And there's also, you wait absolutely ages for a murder in at Bertram's hotel, but my God, when one comes along, is it striking? And again, I think it's quite noir. The way she describes it is the screaming dash, a woman's dash, was piercing the mist with a note of terror. Father could dimly visualize a woman's figure backed against a railing. She wore a long pale fur coat and her shining blonde hair hung down each side of her face. And that's Elvira reacting to Michael Gorman, who's just been shot.
Yes.
And that's the way that's described is fantastic.
We know that there is a big fan, this genre, this hardboiled genre, is Albert in By the Pricking of My Thumb. So
or Alfred, as I call him.
Or Alfred, as you like
Don't
to
ask
call
me
him.
why.
We've seen Albert in earlier Tommy and Tuppence stories, so now he's grown up. But he's
like
always
their kind
been
of sidekick, isn't he?
Yes. And he's always been interested in films. Tommy is wondering where Tuppence has got to. Albert, of course, thinks of a gang must have her. And Tommy says, what the devil do you mean they've got her? The things you read, who've got her? And then Albert says, one of those gangs with flick knives, maybe, or an international one.
We should have played bingo with flick knives. She says flick knives quite a lot in various...
Big shorthand again, though, isn't it?
Yeah,
because that is
for that kind
a
of
violent young man or a gang.
It's the stiletto knife that Mrs. Lancaster gets out. The gag of this is Tommy's like, oh, you're preposterous. This is just the nonsense you read. Yes. But Albert's right, because Killer Kate from formerly of the gang does have tuppence. Oh. And all of this is boiled down rather beautifully in Poirot's newfound endeavour, which is a new addition to Poirot's character in the 60s books uniquely, I think.
Yes.
You hear about it in the clocks and it's capped off in Third Girl, I think. And this is that he's writing a magnum opus and he's studying crime fiction. And it is if, I think I said the other day or in another episode, that it's as if the walls of the kind of truth and reality are becoming porous, and Poirot's becoming even more of a metatextual character to us all, because at this point we've lived with him for so long and he's ceasing to become unreal. He's such an icon and such a larger than life figure at this point. But Lamb, when he visits him, he asks him if he's looking at the tough school, aka hardboiled crime. And Poirot says, violence for violence sake, since when has that been interesting? He does, however, go on to say, but I give American crime fiction on the whole a pretty high place. It's not complete dismissal, certainly not of everything that's going on in terms of American crime literature at this time. There is nuance there. This is kind of capped off in Third Girl, by which point he's completed this magnum opus and he's looking for something else. But I just love the idea. I mean, I think some fans feel like that's not quite what Poirot would do, would be to sit around and think about, and read crime novels.
I think there's definitely a lot of Agatha Christie's opinions coming out from Poirot's mouth.
Yeah, but that's okay. I quite like that.
But it's insightful too.
Yeah, and if he feels like he's kind of solved every real quote unquote in his world crime that there is, so of course he's going to turn to the only. I'm sure as crime readers we all know that feeling of just wanting to grab for another mystery. We're just addicts of it. We just want the next one, and it's kind of Poirot's with us on that. I like that the character that we adore so much is with us on that.
We say that as people who went to a bookshop yesterday, and I walked out with 4 crime books.
You did.
having
2 Naya Marshes.
2 Naya Marshes.
2
I've only got one left to
Christies.
get, and 2 Christies.
Oh, really? Only one left? A whole shelf behind me, listener.
Shelf.
And I walked out with a beautiful old Penguin copy of Seven Dials Mystery, which is one of the few that my mum doesn't have in her collection currently because she gave some away. But it's a beautiful edition, and I'm very excited to give it to her.
That's a bit of advice for everyone listening. Don't give your Christies
Yes.
away. The number of people who've told me I gave them away because I thought I'd never read them again. Or sometimes you go off her for a little bit, like any author, and then people come back. Like, especially, I've known people who think, oh, well, I'm enjoying this other author more now. But you always come back to Christie.
Oh, always. And also those old paperbacks, even if they go out of fashion for a bit, they retain, for me, they're just beautiful, aren't they? They're just such special editions. But yeah, I mean, if anyone is out there at risk of kind of falling away from Christie, then that's what this podcast is for. We're bringing you back. We're showing you all sorts of angles of Agatha Christie that you never knew existed. That's the plan, isn't it? And now, of course, we know that Christie has really horrific elements peppered throughout her books, not just the 60s books, but the adaptational world has a somewhat complicated relationship with that sometimes, I think, as they try and fit her into genre brackets. Is that fair to say? And we see this in the 60s films, right?
Yeah, they're a bit sanitised. Like we're saying about the Margaret Rutherford films in another episode, but they have to be right for general audiences.
Yes.
And so they sort of do this thing of like, you can have some creepy moments. I mean, we watched Murder, She Said.
Murder, She Said is a film adaptation of 450 from Paddington and the first of 4 MGM films to star Margaret Rutherford as Miss Marple from 1961.
And there are moments of when Joan Hickson's character is out and about and it's all a bit spooky, but it gets passed over really quickly.
Yes.
Like you can have a power cut and it might be spooky for 90 seconds, but then everything is fine again. And so there's a lot of this of like a moment of shock, a moment almost of horror, and then sort of swerving away from it. Murder at the Gallop. Murder at the Gallop is a loose film adaptation of After the Funeral with Margaret Rutherford's Miss Marple from 1963. We have Cora murdered with a hat pin.
Yes.
And actually we have Miss Marple creepily approaching him. And it always reminds me a little bit of in Psycho when we approached Norman's mother in the basement. And actually, of course, Norman's mother's a corpse. And so when it spins around, she's like a skeleton.
Yeah.
And I think you pointed out about...
I zoomed in to see if there was any fake blood on the hat pin that kills Cora. And of course there is. But actually, I also noticed when I was looking at that stuff that the very last line of the film is Marple saying, I disapprove of blood sports. and being a double meaning, she's talking about blood sports, but she's also talking about crime fiction, essentially. The sort of crime fiction she's been caught up in. I also like that quote because it feels like a counterpart to Poirot's I disapprove of murder. It's like Rutherford's version. It's like the Rutherford remix of Poirot's I disapprove of murder. Staying on Gallop, I mean, some of the violence that we see in that is definitely on the cartoonish end rather than on the horrific end. I think we see lobbing a vase, basically. We see the act of preparing to strike someone with a golf club, but it's not hard-hitting, which is in a way doing a disservice to the severity with which Christie tackles violence and horror in her source materials.
And our favourite, And Then There Were None. And Then There Were None is a film adaptation of the titular story about a group of guests picked off one by one by a mysterious killer. This one's from 1965. But that allows itself to be a little bit more scary than, say, the Rutherfords, even though it's the same director, George Pollock.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, but clearly, as we were saying before, aimed slightly younger, I think, because, for the sort of stars who are in it. So I guess that allows the scary, I'm not going to quite say horror, but the scary quotient to be a little bit higher in it. Because, you were pointing about, like, there's an injection at one point, which is one of the ways.
Yeah, and the way it's framed is very pulpy and it's almost Hitchcockian. And actually, even the montage that we get so for the listener, if you haven't seen it, at the point at which you're, as All About Agatha would say, at the end of the world as it appears to be, or the denouement where you're finding out who done it, we get a cinema break and we get a narration telling us,
ladies and gentlemen, let us pause to consider the plight of these two people who were learning to trust each other. Now, for the first time in motion pictures, we offer you a whodunit break.
And we're invited to discuss with the person next to us who done it. And even that montage, Shelley Eaton with a clock superimposed on her face. And again, it's very pulpy, it's very noir.
Your time is up, ladies and gentlemen. We've given you the opportunity to solve the mystery, but we doubt that you've guessed right. Don't be surprised at the next thing you see.
And actually, it just struck me as we were talking about Frostquake Horrorscape, the bleak snow-filled landscape of And Then There Were None has a Frankenstein thing going on there as well, I think.
Yeah. One of the films we haven't really spoken about, because it's such an anomaly, is this film of Spider's Web. The Spider's Web is a film adaptation of Christie's light mystery play of the same name, released in 1960. What's interesting about that in terms of horror is in the publicity. Now, Spider's Web as a play, it's a bit of a farce. There is a murder in it, but it is fun. You wouldn't know that from the poster.
No, when you showed me this, I was absolutely agog. But the posters, on the other hand...
You've got, Glynis Johns looking down, either being scared or being scary. It's a bit difficult to tell, but her eyes are sort of, really wide. And I love the... I think I'm really rude about this in Agatha Christie on screen again. It's terrible, isn't it? You could always tell when I was tired writing that, because I always have something like... But it had the tagline of, don't tell your friends the ending. They won't believe it. And I was like, I think it's quite plausible. They'll believe the ending.
You should have said in one of your acerbic asides, you should have said, don't tell your friends the ending, they won't care.
I was just leaning in because I think there's a notice on the poster that, like Psycho, if you went to see Psycho at the cinema, you had to see it from the beginning, which seems sort of obvious now. But this was when films were played on a loop, basically. So you'd be told when they're going to start, but you could go in whenever you like. So you might come in, watch the last 15 minutes of Psycho, then watch the B picture, watch a couple of cartoons, and then see the beginning. This, Psycho, you weren't allowed to do it, and Spider's Web, there is a notice saying, no one seated during the last lethal 5 minutes of the picture.
Wow. I don't remember the last 5 minutes being particularly galling.
No.
And not only is, in terms of typography and Glynis John and all the rest of it, is very much situating it in the horror world, but it's also this lurid yellow. And you mentioned earlier, we were talking the cover of By the Pricking of My Thumbs, which is that same bright yellow, almost pop arty, but definitely aligning it in an older horror tradition, I think, as well. And this is all relevant because I recently saw there was a fantastic exhibition in Oxford called Colour Revolution, which was about basically how the Victorians developed colour and how the world was not dreary and black and white before colour came along. I'm using air quotes. It was absolutely fascinating. And one of the main reasons I found it fascinating, which is relevant to this project, is I thought it's exactly what we're trying to do, which is going, that stuff that you're slightly dismissive of because it's a bit old-fashioned. Well, it's actually not as old-fashioned as you think. And, here's the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford doing the same thing for Victoriana. So, but anyway, the point being that they talked about how books in the late 19th, early 20th century were jacketed in this lurid yellow to mean licentiousness. It came from essentially French pornography. Was initially, it was a signal to say there's going to be extreme sexual content in this. This is literally here to grab your eye. And then that became, I think Dracula, the first edition of Dracula, was this bright yellow, and it became associated with these seminal horror texts. And not only is By the Pricking of My Thumbs first edition, knowingly or otherwise, aligning itself with that, but this poster for the Spider's Web is doing the same thing.
Yeah, and it's a genre is being imposed on Agatha Christie for the big screen.
Yes.
So we had this with comedy for the Margaret Rutherford films, but here it's horror. It's like just again air quotes, being an Agatha Christie type mystery is not enough. That film perhaps needed another genre.
I guess it's another selling point, isn't it? I guess even to this day we see Haunting in Venice is selling itself as a ghost story, as well as to some extent a Christie story. Rightly or wrongly, there is this perception at the time, and it seems to be a perception that Christie has too, that crime is increasing. Violent crime in particular is on the rise. I think Poirot even says that pretty much verbatim in Halloween Party, and Christie, as we'll see from interview tidbits that you've unearthed, says similar. Is it true? I mean, Sandbrook does have several stats, things like between 1955 and 1961, the number of boys between 14 and 17 convicted of serious offences doubled, with a similar increase between 17 to 21-year-olds. And the post-war period saw this consistent rise in crime, he says. In 1955, there were just under 6,000 violent crimes a year in Britain. In 1960, it was almost 12,000. And by 1970, we're on 21,000. There is this perception that because there is a boom of the post-war generation, basically there's just more young people in society, young people that are loose end because of inequality, and the country's still rebuilding itself. So it's not a moral panic without foundation. However, there are older moral crusaders that define this time as a time of real threat and fear in a way that, crime has obviously always existed. Violence has obviously always existed.
And I think people generally always feel that crime's on the rise, whether the statistics show that or not.
Well, it's certainly something that's always in the press, whether or not it's true. Yeah, completely. You're right to bring nuance to that for sure.
And Christie clearly felt this, though. She felt this very strongly. So in By the Pricking of My Thumbs, characters talking about, even in the countryside, one character says that scared stiff we'd been all over the countryside on account of things that had been going on. Child murders. Little girl of 9 years old first. Didn't come home from school one day. Whole neighbourhood was out searching for her. Strangled she'd been. It makes me shiver still to think of it. That was the first. Then about 3 weeks later, another.
You make the point in your Poirot book that she was a big one for scouring the newspapers. And I think, but people say today, and it's true, that obviously it's important to stay informed, but sometimes the more you digest all that stuff, the more you do feel like the world is a terrible place, and it kind of is, but that definitely doesn't help. That was something that she was keen on. And was she actively looking for inspiration?
So ahead of writing Hallowe'en Party, she spent 3 weeks going through newspapers. And again, we might say that the reporting of incidents from the late 50s onwards, these more perhaps salacious crimes do get more emphasis in newspapers than maybe they had done before. But she said about how every day there was somebody murdered, some girl killed, some child missing and strangled. I think it's a sign of the times. I think that some of the crimes that were really informing her being really cynical about society and that informing it were some of the really high-profile ones from the 60s. So things like the Moors murders, things like the Mary Bell case, which all involve children. You can absolutely understand these cases being given huge emphasis in the press are exactly the sort of thing.
The temptation is to say, and we've said this countless times before, the temptation is to think of Christie as sort of shaking her fist at the world slightly. But of course, the murder of young people, well, the murder of anyone, but especially the murder of young people, which several of her 60s books depict, is something to be scared of, to remark upon. It's a terrible thing.
And it's a legitimate fear, isn't it, to be?
And I think I'm right in saying in one of the 60s interviews, she was asked specifically about how often she's inspired by real life murders.
This isn't just a 1960s thing. She's been interested in real life cases all the way through her career. You can go back to Murder on the Links, which is only the second Poirot novel back in the 1920s. And that was very much inspired by a real life case. And she said in one of the interviews in the 60s about just occasionally I'd become interested in real murder cases. Do you remember and then this was redacted in the interview.
Which is fascinating, isn't it? That's really fascinating. Yeah. We don't have any sense of what it could be.
There are possibilities. Do you remember the redacted affair? I was rather interested in that. The old lady died and then somebody else died and the only people left were the married daughter and her husband. I believe that it was never cleared up. Of course, I may be wrong, but I always rather thought the married daughter must have done it. One of my obsessions from this decade is that Agatha Christie was asked to write for one of the weekend broadsheet newspapers where they were doing an article about the Charles Bravo case, which was from the 19th century, where this lawyer was poisoned. It's all about how he might have been poisoned. And I think that, again, might be a story for another time. But what's really interesting is at this time, where she didn't give interviews or very rarely gave them, and that she certainly wasn't taking on extra work, she gave them this really detailed response that they printed in full, which I mention in my Marple book, because I think it's a quite nice indication
Pre-order now.
that she was starting to actually doing a bit of a Miss Marple here, because she talks about human nature and that this is what people would be like, and she even invokes like memories of her grandmother and stuff, which is such a Miss Marple thing to do. And so
I mean, I won't be the first person to say this, obviously, but there is something in the fact that we engage with real life adversity on a puzzle level, on something to be picked over and disseminated as a way of dealing with it. And I think that's foundational to everything that Christie writes. And I can see her getting carried away in the mechanics of something like that. When we were reading The Clocks, you said, and had it only just occurred to you on this rereading?
Because
this is the Somerton Man, he said to me, which I'd never heard of.
It was quite a famous case, which amazingly has been solved really recently.
Oh, wow.
The Somerton Man is a case of a man who was found deceased on a beach in Australia in 1948. And what was interesting about him was that nobody could work out who he was in all sorts of ways. So his clothes they seemed to be American, but the labels had been cut out, I think. What's really interesting is that one of the things was the final, or something that was taken from a page of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, and apologies if any of that is mispronounced, which was one of the things that Agatha Christie was really interested in this book. And actually, her first unpublished novel quotes from that, Snow Upon the Desert.
Wow.
So it's coincidence.
So there's a connection there.
So there's a connection. So I wonder whether Christie would have been interested. And it was a mystery for many, many years as to, was this man a spy? That was the most prominent mystery. So it just made me think that that's So the Clocks. In terms of the body that we find
completely
there.
confounding premise.
Yeah, and then codes. There was a code found because they finally found the copy of the book that it had been taken from, like the actual literal copy that had been ripped out. And there was like a code in the front that seemed to be a phone number. It's real spy thrillery stuff. Some of the clocks had been gestating for a long. A part of the premise she wrote up as actually a competition many sort of decades earlier
in the Second World War, wasn't it?
Yeah, so it had been clearly been sort of cooking in her brain for a little while.
Yeah.
But whether this is something that helped propel it on forwards, perhaps that's possible.
All right, next time, tune in, drop everything, peace out. It's drugs. We're looking at drugs and Agatha Christie. Who would have thought it?
Well, do get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. You can find us across social media at Christie_time, or you can email us at theswingingchristies@gmail.com. Also our website, that's at christietime.com, and you can find us individually on X at classic_Graham for Gray and at Dr. Mark Aldridge for me, and I'm also on Insta.
And you can find links to Mark's books. So there's Agatha Christie on Screen, Agatha Christie's Poirot, the Greatest Detective in the World, and the forthcoming Agatha Christie's Marple Expert on Wickedness. Pre-order now. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for listening, you sacrificial lambs. The Swinging Christies they get worse.
They do
The
get
Swinging Christies is a Christie Time project by Dr. Mark Aldridge and Gray Robert Brown. This episode was recorded on the 6th of January 2024. Our artwork was designed by Bartlett Studio, and our music is by Dar Golan. Oh, and I had an idea of what we could talk about at the end, because you love a coda.
I love a coda.
So do you remember way back in the intro episode, you said
yes,
that your collection...
I had this written down.
Oh,
I
did
had
you?
This written down.
No,
something
no.
we've got to discuss at some point.
So you say your mum's collection was almost complete, but you don't know specifically what she was missing.
It was I think it was mostly short story collections and a couple of the early thrillery novels.
And of course, you told us at the time that she was going off that paper bookmark, which was slightly incomplete and slightly dodgy in terms of its accuracy anyway. Whereas by the time I was collecting, or rather verifying my mum's collection, I had Wikipedia to go off.
That's the first thing you did. I bet you get your little list out and go together.
Don't even joke, it's true. I genuinely did. Because she told me, my mum, bless her, love you, hello. She told me that she had every single one.
You set out to prove her wrong.
To me, that's a challenge.
Yes.
So I remember going, well, you don't have Done Witness. And she would search and she would go, well, yes, I do. I have it in this compilation hardback. The like big blue, like St. Michael's with Peter Ustinov on the front, I think. Even though he was never in Done Witness, but whatever. And then I go, well, you don't have The Unexpected Guest, brackets Charles Osborne. And she'd go, well, no, because that's not a proper Agatha Christie novel. That was a novelisation of a play she wrote. And she foxed me every time. She bested me. And the only one that she did not have, genuinely, the only one that I could actually find she did not have was The Pale Horse.
Wow.
And then years later, obviously, we've said before, we met through our mutual friend Jamie Berntal, and he helped me with my dissertation at uni. I was an undergrad and he was doing his PhD at Exeter. And one of the first things I said to him, we met in Queen's Cafe. I remember we sat down with a coffee. I've got to ask, is there some reason why the Pale Horse Fontanas would have been harder to find? Because my mum had collected these books over time, and for some reason I was like, the only reason she would search, like scour car boot sales and WH Smith's and everything. I was like, there must have been some distribution reason as to why, were fewer printed. I don't get it. And Jamie said, no, there's no reason why the Pale Horse would be less available for your mum. But he said, I've got a spare one. And he posted to my mum a Fontana, a beautiful cover as well. It's got a sort of big horse kind of rising up on it. And it's like a navy blue, I think, colour from recollection. And he sent it to my mum to complete her collection. I know. How lovely. But yes, there you go. So we had that little cliffhanger of what was the one book that my mum didn't have in her collection. And of course, it was a 60s one, because all roads lead back to the 60s, don't they?
They do for us, yes.
Yeah.